The Franciscan Ministry Series was created to inspire our ministry boards, leaders, staff, and volunteers to develop a deeper understanding of the Franciscan worldview that unites us. These videos are designed to help us all make operational and strategic decisions that are aligned with our Franciscan mission and ensure that our ministries embody our Catholic Franciscan legacy. We are grateful to all that have brought this series to fruition, especially Brother Bill Short.
Ministry as a Journey. Francis of Assisi was born in the late 12th century, almost 800 years ago. He was born in a little town in central Italy. Assisi was an important merchant center. It was a center for commerce and trade. He grew up there working in his family's cloth business. His ideal, though, was to be something greater than just somebody who sold clothing. He started out on a military career to earn the title of being a knight, something very important in the Middle Ages. His first attempts at that were not very successful. In his first battle, he ended up being taken as a prisoner of war. He had to be ransomed after almost a year in prison, and he came back to his hometown in his early 20s as someone who was pretty sick and disillusioned. Through a series of religious experiences, he went through a big conversion, a big change in his life. And what we're going to see over the course of these lectures is the way that Francis grows and develops in his own personal journey. Our own ministries in the St. Barbara province are on a journey as well. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to see some connections between the personal story of Francis and some of the things that go on in your own life and in the ministries that you serve. So Francis wasn't very successful in his military career, but he still wanted to do great deeds. And with this kind of religious conversion that began to change the way that he thought, he started working in a completely different area. He started working in construction, repairing abandoned churches around his hometown. And at one of those churches down in the valley below Assisi, he met people from a local hospice or hospital who had Hansen's disease, leprosy. And even though he said at the beginning he was really afraid of being around them, of course, he was afraid of catching that disease, he found the courage somehow to go and serve them. He said that was God's inspiration. That was a changing point in his life. His journey really took a new direction after that. And he said being with lepers seemed bitter to him at first, but afterwards it turned into something sweet. He had changed. And over the course of the next few years, other men in the town of Assisi were really impressed by Francis's example. They joined him, so he had a little community around him. Within about 3 years, one of the noble women of Assisi, a young woman named Claire, decided that she wanted to join this group, which originally was just made up of men. She joined and began her own community of women following a similar form of life, caring for the sick at a little monastery called San Damiano outside town, and gradually growing that community until it reached 50 during her lifetime. Francis and Claire have different journeys, but they're inspired by the same example, the example of Jesus in the gospel, who's close to people who are suffering, to the sick, even people with leprosy, and someone who is constantly giving to others generously. As Francis develops along his own journey, one of the important things that he comes to understand is that the work that he is doing is inspired by the gospel, something that he reads constantly in the New Testament, the words of Jesus and the example of Jesus. But he also knows that if this little group of his is going to have a chance to succeed, he also wants to have some kind of official approval from the church. By 1209, Francis has 12 followers, not a very big group, the same number that Jesus had as apostles. He sets out on foot with his little band of followers to meet probably the most powerful pope in the history of the Catholic Church, Pope Innocent III. I would think meeting him could be kind of intimidating. Francis approaches him with his own simplicity and humility. He has a few verses from the gospel written down on a piece of paper and hands them to the Pope and said, "Will you give us some kind of approval that we're okay, that the church recognizes us?" And Pope Innocent, we don't know exactly what he thought. Maybe he had a few doubts. He said, "Okay, give it a try and come back in a few years and we'll see how you're doing." Probably thinking, I'm never going to see this guy again. 800 years later, we know that Pope Innocent was actually a pretty wise pope. The group that he had approved actually started to grow. Francis's community begins to grow into the dozens and then into the hundreds. Claire's own community of women at that little monastery of San Damiano begins to grow. Her younger sister and eventually another sister and even her widowed mother will eventually come and join her community. We've got growth, we've got change in this journey. Something that's familiar to us also from our experience in St. Barbara Province. As ministries that began small, 12 might actually be a large number for some of our places. But we've seen some of our ministries grow and grow. We've had to go to the church for approval, and we've been fortunate in having people, maybe not like a pope, but we've had people representing the church, bishops and others, who have treated us with kindness and have given us the benefit of the doubt. But Francis also takes a physical journey. He's not going to stay just in central Italy, in his safe hometown. He branches out and sends his followers out throughout central Italy, then into the south, into the north. Pretty soon they're crossing the Alps, going into France. They soon arrive in England, in Ireland. This expansion into becoming an international community brings with it new challenges and new questions. Francis and his community, the way that they minister, has to adapt to these new circumstances. One of the things that Pope Innocent had approved for Francis and his followers was a simple form of preaching. They were not educated men, so they weren't allowed to preach on doctrines of the Catholic faith or complicated theological questions. But they could give a simple form of preaching to call people to a change of heart. This probably was not done in churches very often, probably done in marketplaces, where people gathered to sell their carrots and trade their eggs, sometimes accompanied with a little music, because Francis was also a good singer and a composer. They would gather a group of people with a little bit of music and then begin to give their sermon. Pretty simple. Do good, avoid evil, particularly make peace. Many of these towns where they visited were torn apart by what we would call gang warfare between opposing groups in the towns, usually headed up by important local families. And the blood feud, the vendetta, revenge killing was a terrible social evil at the time. Francis and his followers put themselves in the middle of the violence of their day and try to make peace through their preaching, but also through negotiating. They're adapting to new circumstances from the society that they meet in their travels. But it doesn't stop with Italy. It doesn't even stop with Europe. Francis thinks that he's got a call to a bigger mission, an international mission. He travels to Spain, and at that time, most of Spain was a Muslim country. He travels to Egypt during the Fifth Crusade, wanting to meet the leader of the Islamic forces fighting there against the Christians in the Fifth Crusade, Malek el-Kamil, the Sultan of Egypt. Over 8 centuries ago, this small, unassuming, not well-educated Italian man goes to meet the most powerful military leader in the Islamic world. And much to his surprise, perhaps, and the surprise of others around him, the Sultan receives Francis graciously, with traditional Muslim hospitality. Francis preaches in the presence of the Sultan, and we're told by his early biographers, the Sultan listened to him willingly. He even tried to give Francis gifts of gold and coins. When Francis refused all of that, the Sultan was even more impressed. Francis's vision of what his ministry was, what his journey was, changed as the horizon opened up beyond just the Christian world into a world that was multi-religious. That encounter shapes Francis and his approach to people who belong to a different religious tradition. Again, a change in the way that he looks at the world. In our own province, I think of a couple of examples of people who have been faced with this kind of challenge in their own ministry. One of them that comes immediately to mind is someone that many of you may not know. Maybe you never even heard of him. His name was Father Hugh Noonan. He was stationed in Los Angeles. At that time, we had St. Joseph's Church downtown in the Garment District. And out of that base, Father Hugh decided in the 1940s that the Franciscans needed to enter the world of communications. He started a little radio show called The Hour of St. Francis. And through his contacts with the Catholic community in Hollywood, he expanded that gradually into TV productions. In fact, the first TV show was actually called The Hour of St. Francis. From radio to TV, they moved then into film and had their own recording studio and put out religious themes in movies that were not heavy on the religion, but heavy on moral persuasion, to look at important social questions of the time, like civil rights and violence, and to tell a story through film in order to get across the message of the gospel. In the 1960s, that became much too expensive. To keep up with all the new technology, the world of computers, as it opened up in the 70s and the 80s, made it more and more difficult for that organization, then called Franciscan Communications, to survive in the high-tech world. The province made the decision to close down that ministry and to share all the resources that had been developed there with another organization called Franciscan Media in Cincinnati, Ohio. So that work goes on, but with a different organization. The province of St. Barbara today is back in the communications business. This video is just one example of that. But we're also in the world of the internet, the province website. Your own ministries, many of them, have their own websites. The use of social media. We continue that task of communicating good news to the people whom we meet and people whom we will never meet through the use of communications. It's not the way that Father Hugh Noonan would have known it in the 50s and 60s. It's changed. But that message continues to be communicated today. Maybe that's the most important story for us to remember. That in our ministries, nothing is perfect. Nothing is ever set in stone. We're always changing, adapting, hopefully improving. And that's okay. Because, like Francis, we too are on a journey, as Jesus' own disciples were, going from town to town, announcing peace and telling people good news.
Key points. Ministries, like our lives and the life of St. Francis, are a journey with moments of significant change or conversion. These moments of conversion turn St. Francis toward God and a new way of life. His conversion was both spiritual and physical. It led him to leave his home and travel without possessions from town to town, working to get food and clothes, and preaching a simple message: do good, avoid evil, and make peace. Just as St. Francis responded to the issues of his day, our ministries look at the important social questions of our times and respond to them. Our ministries change and adapt to the times, but always announce peace and share the good news of God's love through the love we express to all we serve. Our ministries are never perfect, and that is okay. Reflection questions. What have been the significant points of change or conversion in your ministry's journey from its inception to now? Which of those changes brought your ministry closer to its Franciscan mission, and which, if any, strayed away from it? What are the big social questions of today? How is your ministry responding?